Good afternoon, Tom. Are you on the call?
Yes, Nick, I'm here, and I think we're just about ready to get started.
Okay, why don't we give it a couple more minutes for anyone on the call, and we'll just wait for a few more to join. I can see people joining now. Thanks, Tom.
Thanks.
Okay, everyone, we'll get going. So good afternoon, and thanks for joining today's webinar on account takeover for the retail industry. My name is Nick Baglin. I'm the General Manager for Traffic Defender, and I'm joined by my colleague Tom Platt, who I'll introduce in just a second. The agenda today is quite a simple one. I will briefly step you through an overview of the account takeover problem as we see it. Then I'll hand over to our expert in this field, Tom Platt, and that's who you're looking at. That's not a bad guy. He may look like a bad guy, but trust me, he's one of the good guys. And he'll step you through why and how these attacks are taking place. He'll then hand back to me just to wrap up, and I promise you one slide only on Intechnica's approach to this problem. This is not designed to be a sales pitch. This is designed to be an educational overview of the findings and views that we see of this growing issue of account takeover. Tom, I think you're driving for me, so can you change the slide? Thank you. Okay, so what is the problem here? So whilst there are many techniques that make up a very successful account takeover attack, the one that we're focusing on is the role that bots play. Bots are the attack vector of choice. Bots are at the center of every single account takeover attempt. And if you haven't got visibility and control of bots accessing your website, then unfortunately you're a much easier target than you think. So today we plan to focus on the specific role that bots play in account takeover, but it would be remiss of me not to mention the other two main attack paths that bots play a major role in, and they also affect the retail industry, but probably not as big as account takeover. The first one of those is ad fraud, probably less relevant to the retail industry, but again, automated software or bots play a major role in this. The next is content scraping. Again, very relevant for the retail industry. We've helped a lot of retailers protect their content and pricing. And again, bots are at the heart of that as well. But the one we plan to talk about today is, of course, account takeover. And account takeover, you can read it for yourself there, is the use of, again, bots, automated software to log in as legitimate users by using stolen or guessed credentials. We really see it as two sides, either brute force attacks where people are using known email addresses but brute forcing and guessing credentials, or from credential stuffing, which is where they've stolen or accessed stolen credentials, usually from the dark web, and then they're trying to access your website using credentials stolen from a different site. But again, you can see the common denominator in all these attacks is bots. And I think whilst the other attacks are aggressive, we definitely see a huge spike in account takeovers. Probably the two industries we see it the most in are gambling and retail. I don't think there's been an end user meeting we've been in the last 6 months where account takeover hasn't been a major part of the agenda. Javelin are suggesting here that it's tripled in the last year. I think that probably is maybe even a conservative estimate to what we see from our own personal engagements. And finally, the impact of bots. This is a fairly old slide taken from 2016. 2016 was the first year where non-human traffic overtook legitimate human traffic. And this was a Cisco slide. They obviously predict that machine traffic will grow year on year, and it's exactly what we've witnessed as well. I think it's fair to say that we see all verticals, and every vertical has a subtly different bot challenge. I'd say the worst we've seen is a car rental company where 92% of their web traffic was bot related. Typically for retailers, we see somewhere in between 45 to 60% of their traffic being bot related. But if your own analysis is different, we'd love to hear from you. But if we don't know what it is, but you want us to check for you, we're very happy to do that. There's a very simple step we can take in order to do that for you. It is, of course, worth pointing out at this stage that within that 51.8%, some of that is legitimate good bot traffic, such as Google, of course. But we work very closely with customers to very clearly profile and classify them out correctly. So we're only focused on the malicious bot activity. And this rapid rise, this sudden injection of tripling over last year is nearly all down to malicious bot activity. The ease of gaining these credentials, the ease of carrying out these attacks is something that Tom will now talk you through. Tom, are you there?
Yes, I'm here, and thanks for that great introduction and background there, Nick. I think it's really useful at setting the scene for what my talk is going to be about today. I think before I go into what the attacks are, the methodologies used by the hackers, I did just want to set the scene a little further in terms of actually what is the goal, what is the purpose of these account takeover attacks. And I think one of the key things to mention and key things to stress is that the account takeover attack itself, be it a dictionary attack or a credential stuffing attack, is quite often the start and often the softer layer of what is a much more sinister attack and effort by the hacker to either defraud a person, individual, or company. So I think it's first to mention that when we're talking about account takeover here, the hacker's goal is very much to seek to verify a pair of credentials, typically a password and username, often from a big data breach against a different site or service that they can find. So what we're seeing here is really a large volume play of hackers using data that they want to validate and essentially see if it's going to be successful on other websites, i.e. trying to get the most value out of breach data that we've seen. And I think this is often the first stage. So the first stage of these attacks is that validation of these passwords and usernames. Quite often what the hacker will do then is sell these. So quite frequently we'll see the value of an account and multiple accounts. Obviously, the first data breach takes place. There's a username and password that's working for one site, and quite often that data breach is reported and that username and password will then be changed. However, those usernames and passwords will quite often be used on other sites. So what we'll see there is the hacker testing them for other sites, and obviously the more sites that these are usable on, the higher the value of that breached credential, name and password. So that's what we quite often see as a second stage in the attack. Or what we may see is that the hacker will then use that username and password to get further details out of the website. That could be PII data, PHI data, it could be financial data, personal addresses, particularly in the retail industry, it could be purchasing history, it could be addresses, credit card details. Any data they can skim out of those accounts could still be part of the second phase of that attack. I think the third and final stage of the attack, and we're not going to cover this so much today, but typically more of a security concern for everyone, is where that data will then be used once we've got the password, we've got the credentials, and potentially some further personal information on the account. That will be used to carry out a potentially gift card scam. It could be used to make fraudulent transactions, or it could be used to hold an individual or company to ransom. So really what we're talking about here today, account takeover, is the very start of what can quite often be a much more malicious attack. I think just to put that into some perspective and give it some context, what we wanted to show you here was just a little bit of the value of some of these credentials that are floating around on the dark web. You can see here PayPal credentials going for as little as $1.50 and Netflix credentials going for $3.05. So there is real value to these criminals, not actually in conducting fraudulent activity, but just validating the password and username pairing, checking it works, and then selling that on the dark web and at high volume. You can see quite quickly how this becomes a very profitable industry to be in. So now I've just put a little bit of perspective in why the hacker is doing this. I wanted to talk about a little bit more about some of the methodologies and common things we see that are taking place. This next part of the talk is going to include some research that we've done through our security team and security experts, along with work that we're doing in tandem with a number of retailers here in the UK and the States. So a bit of a mix of research here, but the first kind of part I wanted to cover, often the start of any account takeover attempt by a hacker, what the hacker will use is an account takeover tool. There's a range of tools out there on the market, THC Hydra, Phantom JS, HTTP Fox. Quite often we see curl scripts being used as well. However, the most common tool out there at the moment by far, and recognized by the 2017 Verizon Data Breaches Survey as the most proliferant tool, is Sentry MBA. Sentry MBA is a particularly popular tool, number one because of the UX and how easy it is for hackers to use, which I'll talk about in a minute, but also I believe because of the marketplace. Having done more research on this tool and going onto the dark web, what we can see is that Sentry MBA is a tool that's available to purchase configured. So it could be configured, purchased configured to launch an attack against a certain site, or it can be purchased in a configurable state. Then what we find is there is a whole marketplace of configurations floating around. So hackers can buy for around $1 to $2 a configuration pack for a website they would like to attack, plug it into Sentry MBA, and then launch that attack on that site. So very little coding and effort required on the hacker's part to use Sentry MBA, and also a whole marketplace around this. When we last checked, there were over 1,800 config files available to purchase, and these were pretty much targeting the top 10% of Alexa 1000 sites. So loads of sites out there that have pre-configured attack files written for them in this tool. Why we wanted to focus about it. So obviously, the marketplace is one reason we are seeing this as a big popular tool of choice, but I did mention the UX, and I did just want to give you a quick sort of screen grab into what the tool looks like and how easy it is to use. It would be as simple as uploading the configuration file, entering the website the attacker wishes to hit, specifying the IP ranges that they've purchased that they'd like to conduct the attack with, and then uploading the breached credentials to attack a site, and literally clicking the start button. It is as quick as that and easy as that for these hackers to launch that attack. Obviously, we've talked there about the attacker using the attack tool. There also are a range of other things and sort of methodologies that hackers are using in these attacks that I now wanted to go on and talk about. The first I alluded to there was the uploading of IP addresses into the attack tool. This is a slide actually from one of the retailers that we're working with. And what we did here is we plotted the attacks that we were seeing on that retailer, and specifically the IP addresses that those attacks were coming from. You can see here each IP address is represented by a dot, and these large groups typically tend to represent a cluster or an IP range. And what we found here is by plotting these IP addresses and the attacks across the amount of days we saw them, we were able to sort of confirm pretty much conclusively that these attackers were rotating IP address, and not only IP address, but IP range on an often daily basis. Typically, you know, what we see this is, it makes this very hard to detect, and it does tend to render any form of IP blocking insignificant, because quite often what we'll see is by the time that the attack is flagged, the IP address is blocked, the attacker has already rotated around to another IP range, potentially in a completely other data center. It's also important to note that the blocking of IPs is becoming more and more dangerous. We're seeing IPs shifting around. So what could have been an attack IP yesterday could be a customer's IP address in the next few months. So a difficult thing to block IP addresses, made even harder by one thing we see commonly. Just yesterday, we were working with one of the UK's leading online publishers. Their attacks tended to stem and utilize reputable sources such as Amazon, Microsoft, Google. So quite often the cloud provided services such as Google, Microsoft and Amazon are used for these attacks, making it extremely difficult for particularly any retail to block these, because blocking a Google range will also be a range that we see Google bots come from to scrape your website for SEO. So making it very difficult. These attackers are piggybacking on the reputations of those, and it's making IP addressing a very difficult thing to do these days. Of course, everyone as well, I'm sure on this webinar, is aware of the rise of VPNs. A particularly interesting conversation point we do have with retailers as to whether they want to sell to people on a VPN. A lot of legitimate users using VPNs now for security reasons. However, the VPN, the rise of it, 65% of people in a Wombat survey in the US were now using corporate or personal VPNs, and 44% of British respondents using corporate or personal VPNs. Obviously, there's a rise in B2C customers using VPNs, and they will be using them for shopping to secure their transactions and make them feel safer. However, ironically, one thing we also see in tandem is the real rise of these attacks coming from VPNs, making it more and more difficult to locate the actual region that the attack is coming from. The attackers, we have found, are becoming smarter and smarter with their use of VPNs as well. I mean, a couple of use cases here. We're showing here a screenshot of product from ISP data center called Hurricane Electric, called Tunnel Port, which is allowing hackers to use IPv6 ranges to get a wider attack range and mask their location geographically. Not only are VPNs allowing hackers to mask their location, we are seeing some clever use of VPNs. If there is a breach credential, say from a user in the UK, the hacker knows that breach credential is coming from the UK. Quite often we may see attack launched from another region, quite often Panama, where they will use a VPN to appear as if they are coming from the UK, so that what we tend to see is that the attack credential pair and location match up to make it even harder for people to attack. So certainly one to watch. I think interestingly, one final comment on this, I talked a lot about pre-configured Sentry MBA files. Ironically, a lot of the pre-configuration files are actually written for some of the common VPN services out there. So quite sadly, what we will see, and I think what we'll see a rise of, is customers of ours and general public buying and purchasing VPN accounts to make their lives more secure, make their online experience more secure. But we are already seeing the rise of account takeovers in those industries, so that hackers will actually be using their VPNs to potentially make them less secure than ever before. So a real challenge there, certainly for those providers, and one that is making the detection of any hackers difficult. I think one of the most common ways of trying to stop this attack, and one that I will talk about a little bit later, is the use of rate limiting. Rate limiting, a common technology that's been around for quite some time now. This was a very interesting slide from a UK retailer, and in fact one that's quite spread across Europe. And we were looking at some of their attack IPs originally, and we were able to detect the behavior here. It's quite difficult to see, but effectively this bar is showing the amount of bandwidth, the amount of requests that the attacker is making, and the dots are showing the pages. And what we see here is that the hacker's attack tool is effectively slowly ramping up the amount of requests it's making, time at time, in a couple of minute intervals, to find actually what is the threshold of rate limiting on the site, what can they get away with, and then sticking at that limit. So what we are seeing now is a real rise in the amount of tools able to detect and fly under rate limiting. So certainly something that we've seen an advance in recently. I will talk a little bit about capture. Capture is obviously one of the most common ways on websites, on forums. I'm sure everyone's been frustrated by seeing a capture. One of the most common ways out there now of trying to stop and prevent all automated traffic. It is defined as the way of confirming if someone is human or not. But I think what we have seen in the past year specifically, certainly throughout 2017, is a real rise in the technology built to bypass this capture. I'm just going to talk about a couple of those methods that are out there today. There are tons of different ways people have finding ways to bypass typically Google Capture, Google Not a Bot services. Ironically, one of the ones that was published a couple of months ago by a security blogger was he'd actually found a way to utilize Google's very own voice recognition API, use the voiceover on the images for the visually impaired, and then play that through Google's voice recognition API and push back a verify through that. So actually using Google's own technology, Google's own voice recognition against them to bypass capture there. Of course, there's similar things being done with optical recognition, and we have seen examples of people starting to talk about using Google's own optical recognition software to bypass their own capture. But I think probably one of the most common and most difficult ways people are using to bypass capture is actually the real rise of click farms, to capture, death by capture services that are out there. These services sometimes have over 1,000 different employees solving hundreds of captures with actual real humans for as little as sub 1 cent prices within 12 seconds. So really what we're seeing here is that actually the captures sometimes are in attacks are being solved by real humans, sadly quite often in third world countries, earning less than a couple of dollars a day for the task. So a real market developed around this, and capture no longer a solid defense against actually what is automated traffic. We are running short on time, so what I want to do is there's a couple of final points on this before I get to best practice. Obviously, everyone is well aware of the rise of compromised devices, browser emulation that's going on. A very quick slide on this, but one of the most common attacks last year, Wirex, the compromised Android network used for a lot of DDoS attacks, but we are seeing compromised networks and botnets used to carry out these account takeover attacks. We are also seeing full stack browser emulation as well in these attacks. So again, making it very difficult for any security professional out there to try and use device recognition, or what devices it's coming in for, trying to check for automated stuff to identify an account takeover. These things are starting to make that harder and harder, because quite frequently it could be coming from a real device owned by a real consumer that has been potentially hacked itself. So the real takeaway, hopefully that's been useful for everyone, but the real takeaways for me in terms of these attacks is that the attackers toolkits are expanding. They are becoming more sophisticated. Just as a quick few words on what we've summarized there, attackers and hackers are able to purchase pre-configured attack tools for major retail sites at low cost. They're able to stuff these with vast quantities of IP addresses that are from reputable sources, making it extremely difficult for any retailer to block these. They're then able to use what we've talked about, rate limiting detection, click farms, voice recognition, and compromised devices, VPNs, to not only mask their identity, but bypass any typical security mitigations that are in place. I think I've talked a lot about the methodology of the attack. I think everyone knows or should be well aware of where these attack credentials are coming from. But I think what we have seen now is traditionally a real security aim and goal of an organization would be to protect their own data. I think now what we are seeing is that people need to be well aware that they may be under attack from other people's data breaches, and that your customers are actually vulnerable from not necessarily your security incidents, but others, and you then become vulnerable in the chain. As we can see here, the typical consumer, I think stats around this, the average UK retail person shopping on retail sites shares the same password for around 8 in 10 sites. a recent survey by LastPass globally, 59% of password reuse out there. And when we are seeing such large data breaches, 3.3 billion credentials leaked last year that we know about and were reported, 2,000 different breaches, there is a lot of data out there for these attackers to use in their tools. And I think most sadly, and something that I will cover in the best practices, we are seeing data from some of the really old breaches still being reused and still being successful. So quite frequently you will see the Yahoo data breach of 2013, 2014, data from that being used in attacks still today, and still potentially providing success for some hackers. And that rolls me really nicely into passwords. I think this is sort of just rolls on there. I think one thing that every security professional should be doing is trying to find that balance between user experience and challenging that to make sure that our users are as safe as possible. Certainly, as we're saying, a lot of these attacks using out of date and old credentials, it's now more and more important than ever for any big retailer, anyone with a big database of username and passwords, to go back through that old list of people and make sure that if people haven't logged in for 1 to 2 years with maybe credentials they've completely forgotten about, that could have been breached in the past, that they should be refreshed and made sure that those are still secure today. Of course, on top of that, there is other things that can be done, ensuring good password practice, making sure that people are using multiple characters, making sure that they're ideally encouraging them not to use passwords that they're using on other sites, and password length. The more and more we can do to encourage our customers to make their site secure, the better. And of course, any logging or any history we have around multi-factor authentication, any history we have around what device, location that our users coming from, can be particularly useful in pinpointing these types of attacks. I think finally one thing that can be done is to limit the amount of login attempts. Obviously this can be really frustrating, and this is certainly where there is a win sort of cost benefit piece to be done around actually, is it worth us doing this? But actually looking at how many times we allow a user to log in with an unknown password and have an error there. So just to wrap up, so that's one of the most common ways. Secondly, I think rate limiting, certainly something everyone should consider. We mentioned before, it won't be fully successful. It will just slow down the pace of these attacks. But anyone out there who has a web application firewall, has the ability to turn on rate limiting, should do that. It's one thing that's going to slow these attackers down. It won't stop them, but anything we can do to stop them and slow them is better than nothing. So certainly one thing you should do today. Finally, what we've done here, the tool Sentry MBA, they do actually use a common set of user agents. We've published these here. These are things that we see commonly used in the attacks, so certainly something you should seek to try and get there to block or at least look for these user agents on your site. And key takeaway here, these bots are becoming more sophisticated. The hackers are mutating in their methodology. Capture, IP blocking, rate limiting, and typical WAF mitigations are no longer a strong defense against account takeover. And I think with that, just over to you there, Nick, just to close off on our approach.
You've left me a very nice 2 minutes. Thank you. So yeah, one slide on our approach is that it's a cloud-based solution that can either sit inline or offline, depending on your preference. But given that we know false positives, i.e. blocking legitimate visitors, is so damaging, our typical approach is to sit offline to begin with, whilst we build up a very clear profile of what your visitor patterns and behaviors are. So reading this slide from left to right, obviously visitors come to the website. The first phase of analysis we'll do is reputational analysis. There is nothing unique about this, and virtually every solution on the market will do it. Some of you may already have bought some of your own reputational databases. We have a combination of paid for and open source ones. For example, Webroot's Bright Cloud database is one of our data feeds that we've acquired. But additionally, and maybe more importantly, we've created our own reputational database of known good and bad actors. We've done that from analyzing traffic from all of our customers over a large amount of time. What we find is that this reputational layer will typically block the majority of malicious bots from hitting your website. It is a critical step which really reduces the noise. However, it doesn't solve all of the problem, and there's still suspicious visitors that really demand deeper investigation. And that's where the critical behavioral analysis layer comes in, and that's really where we're making our mark in the industry. Most vendors will claim to have some sort of machine learning as part of their solution, but time after time we find that the depth we go into at this level is our real differentiator. Now, for account takeover, we test against, for instance, 150 data points around the login page alone. And this feeds into our machine learning algorithm. For example, we examine pattern time analysis, anomalous browser types, whether mouse trails are present, the speed of typing of the password. And this machine learning algorithm is then further enhanced by our data scientist team. Just this week, for instance, they developed several bespoke algorithms for one of our customers who's been hit by a very specific attack that was customized for their website. So the combination of the machine learning and the manual human analysis is one that we greatly believe in is really borne out in the results. So because we've done this behavioral analysis, we're able to assign a very accurate threat score, which then feeds into actionable insight for you. That can obviously be integrated with your SIEM platform, or it can be through our own dashboard. And then there's a vital feedback loop where you will either take the action to block, ask us to take the action to block, or actually provide further analysis where, no, you want us to go back and do more behavioral analysis on it. And again, it will lead you to basically have full confidence over time that you have legitimate visitors and you're blocking the right malicious bots. So that concludes today's webinar. I'm hoping that the last slide has whet your appetite to want to come back to speak to us more about it. We definitely didn't want to turn it into a broad sales pitch, but I know some of you will be interested in what our approach is. One final thought to consider is that we do offer a bot audit where we'll analyze your logs and give you detailed visibility into the extent of the bot traffic and helping to identify where account takeover is happening on your website. If you feel compelled to want to speak to us about that, we'd be delighted to hear from you. But thank you for joining today and have a nice day. Thank you. Bye-bye.